Hello and welcome to another episode of the Security Fair, the flagship podcast of the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategy, or CISES, where I explore strategy, defence, economics and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, Director of Policy at CISES. Today we're looking at political instability, information control and regional power dynamics in the Middle East, from protest and digital repression in Iran to shifting Gulf priorities and the evolving security landscape in Syria. I'm joined by Arthur Woollam-Hughes, a policy analyst here at the centre. Arthur has completed a master's degree in politics and international studies, focusing on Middle East at SOAS University of London. His research focuses on Middle East politics and security, foreign policy analysis, and the intersection of economic, technological, and defence considerations in regional strategy. His master's dissertation examines multi-vector relations in a post-Cold War setting, tracing how states navigate competing power centres while translating foreign policy choices into concrete economic and defence outcomes. Arthur, it's great to have you with us.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
When we talk about the protests sweeping Iran these past few weeks, sparked by economic grievances, what is the situation on the ground and how reliable are the signals we're getting through social media and reporting given the near total nationwide internet blackout?
So in regards to the situation of the ground, it's quite hard to tell because of the unreliability of social media reports. However, from what I can ascertain, for the most part, the protests have died down. The Iranian government is currently going through several security sweeps. They're arresting people they allege to be part of terrorist organizations or foreign covert networks. How substantiated these claims are we won't know until the coming months, I think. When it comes to the social media sort of landscape and open source intelligence, I think that it's become increasingly polarized, and due to the increasing polarization, it's become increasingly unreliable. You can see people on Twitter, well, X, posting videos that are weeks old, even decades old, of protests in Iran. There's AI videos of people renaming signs Trump Street, and it will have the AI just at the bottom of the clip, powered by Gemini or powered by another AI company. So it's incredibly unreliable, and I think that what we're seeing now is that as the protests have drawn on and government repression has increased, is that we're seeing lines being drawn between people who are pro-regime, anti-regime, and there is a very small amount of people in the middle. And generally speaking, news accounts, state media, non-state media, on all sides of the spectrum are either in one camp or the other. And we're not really seeing anything reliable that can be given off unless you have to look at both sources and then analyze it for yourself. I think that one of the things I found as a real sign of this was that on Instagram I follow this Lebanese influencer, and she went to Iran for a holiday just before the protests and during the protests, and her updates were probably the most accurate because there was no sort of bias. It was just someone who was there who didn't really have a stake in the game. Just filming on Instagram, and then obviously when the blackout came and she left, she basically said in Tehran, this was a few days ago, it was completely quiet. There was hardly any protests, and in other cities the protests would be a few people just burning bins and things like that. That's not to say they weren't substantial in other areas, especially in Mashhad, but I think that the anti-Iran government crowd definitely fanned the flames on social media to make the protests seem a lot bigger than they actually were, and a lot more of a threat to the Islamic Republic than they actually were.
So, focusing maybe on the blackout, how should we interpret the Iranian government's strategy of cutting internet and phone connections to the outside world? Is this primarily a tool of repression, or is this just a way to constrain visible dissent?
I think it's both. I think that one of the first of all, Iran has always done this. Since internet has been freely available in Iran, since phone receptions, the Iranian government has constantly whenever there's dissent, whenever there's protest, whenever there's unrest, it's either been rolling internet blackouts where internet will be blacked out in one region, or so on and so forth, and same with phone lines. So this is very much par for the course with how Iran's handling these protests. It's very much how Iran has handled every protest since the Islamic Revolution. So I think that in terms of what the internet blackouts were meant, what the Iran state wanted with the internet blackouts was to mostly diminish organizing power amongst protesters. So they couldn't communicate by signal, they couldn't communicate by WhatsApp or Telegram. And I think that one of the most significant things with this internet blackout is that the Iranian government claims to be able to shut down Starlink, which is something that Elon Musk championed as very hard or impossible to shut down. So I think that it's primarily it's to repress the protesters, repress their organizing capabilities, and diminish their logistics. As well as this, it stops any sort of information getting out of Iran and any information getting into Iran. So it can isolate the protesters in Iran from their domestic support network and from their international support network. In addition, it can also stop people outside of Iran, the rest of the world, understanding what's going on, seeing what's happening on the ground. And then they have to rely on all these fake news channels. They have to rely on the to be able to ascertain the authenticity of every single social media statement and post you see. So I think that the Iranian government cutting off the internet, it serves to repress and cut off the logistics and isolate the domestic protesters from their domestic and international allies. But it also seeks to create confusion on what's going on in Iran based off the internet blackout and the disparity in reports that we see from both sides.
So, keeping up with the social media theme, they are competing figures on protesters' deaths. I think we've seen estimates from 3,000 to 20,000, and narratives over violence, like you said, whether the protests are ongoing or not. How would you assess the credibility of open source reporting? I think you've mentioned it's increasingly polarized versus state media, especially under such blackout conditions, which you mentioned saw confusion abroad on what's going on.
So I think with open source networks and open source media, it's quite interesting, because I think what we're going to see in the future is that states, especially authoritarian states, will co-opt open source intelligence networks to spread propaganda. And I think we're already seeing this in Ukraine, with how a lot of Russian Telegram networks were reporting things as they were happening, which indicates they had a level of connections to the Russian military apparatus that I don't think would be possible for someone who was just an individual or a citizen journalist. So I think in Iran we're seeing the same thing. I think that open source networks, they can be reliable and they can be a very good way to understand what's happening on the ground. However, I think when it comes to open source, there are its limitations, especially when you're dealing with authoritarian regimes who are very good at co-opting them, and especially when you're also good at dealing with various other regimes who are against the Islamic Republic, who are essentially trying to sow discontent, sow discord, and it's information warfare. So I think what we're going to see in the future is open source intelligence networks being a battleground of information warfare. And I think we're going to see polarized accounts, and I don't see that happening. I think there are unbiased, and there are people in the community who work very hard to make sure they produce neutral and unbiased sources. However, due to the internet blackout, it's increasingly hard to find neutral and unbiased sources, because things will either come from the state media, they will be leaked, and the authenticity of the leaks from the protest is very hard to ascertain. And of course, they will come from people whose best interests are to see the Islamic Republic be toppled.
So, keeping up with the social media angle, to what degrees can platform like X, you also mentioned Telegram, still shape international perception when connectivity is so constrained?
I think they are amazing I think they are so good at essentially raising awareness. And we've seen this since October 7th with the current conflict in Israel and Palestine, that social media is an amazing platform to raise awareness, and it's becoming a battleground, not just sort of on the ground, but sort of in the internet. And I think what we're seeing with the Iran protests is very much the same. We're seeing that people are regularly, I can go on Instagram and I can look at my friends and they're posting about Iran, either for the government or against the government, or trying to be a bit more neutral. And then I'm seeing this on Twitter, X now, Twitter, X, even LinkedIn and Telegram and Signal, like all these channels. What we're seeing is increasing. People are becoming more aware of global events. Not only are people becoming more aware of them, they are also drawing their own opinions. They're also doing their own analysis. And while it's becoming polarized, more people are having lines in the sand. And this enables governments to either produce like a cause, justification for intervention, or justification against intervention. So I think that increasingly social media is becoming a key part of shaping people's perception of international policy, and especially when it comes to democracies. When the public have a certain perception based from social media, that will influence the electorate, and that will also influence politicians, because they will be able to see how their electorate thinks on certain international matters. So I think it's really good at increasing awareness, not just of the Iran protests, but of international affairs in general.
So you mentioned foreign intervention, which links to the next point. Washington has threatened sanctions and grave consequences if executions resume. Trump reportedly mentioned that some hangings have been cancelled or postponed, and is reportedly weighing options, both cyber and military responses to the crisis. I think two American carrier strikes groups are moving towards the Middle East, and should arrive, I think, around next week. So how central would you say have this crisis in Iran become in US foreign policy decision making, and what risk does that pose for escalation?
I think the US has always been consistent since the Islamic Revolution on its policy towards Iran. While obviously before the Islamic Revolution, there was a lot of rumors and conspiracies about the US helping to overthrow the Shah. And of course, there's the Iran-Contra scandal. These are things we can't sort of look away with. However, generally speaking, the US's position is to be against the Islamic Republic. It's to be for intervention, sanctions, in order to sort of weaken it and stop its spread of its influence across the Middle East and further afield. I think that when it comes to the situation with the Iran protests, they serve, like I said in my earlier point, they serve as a good way to get the American electorate to be supportive of intervention. However, I do not think that is a be all and end all when it comes to American foreign policy decision making. I think that America's policy on Iran is also majorly decided by its allies in the region. So I think that with Iran, it's sandwiched between Pakistan, an American ally, and a very important American ally in Central Asia. It borders China, it borders Afghanistan, and also borders India. And then to the west, Iran borders Turkey, and Turkey is the second largest power in NATO. Has the second largest army in NATO. It has one of the largest air forces in Europe, and it is increasingly important in the Middle East as it exercises its influence in its neighboring countries to maintain good relations with Turkey. And I think that both Turkey, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, another US ally, which is on the other side of the Gulf from Iran, are cautioning against intervention. And these cautions against intervention, I think, will play a larger part in whether the US decides to intervene militarily or doesn't decide. Because I think that America would listen to its allies in the region, especially its allies such as Turkey, which is a NATO member, and it's neither in the interests of Turkey, Pakistan, or Saudi Arabia for the Iranian government to completely collapse. So I think that the protests are important to having a justification for the electorate, but American foreign policy has always been consistent with Iran, and whether a military strike happens will be decided by America with advice from its allies in the region.
So Iranian officials have characterized foreign statements, including Trump's, as interference. There have also been allegations of the protests being color revolutions or foreign backed. How should we interpret the regime's framing of external support as a justification for harsher domestic repression?
So firstly, I think there's no justification for shooting peaceful protesters, and whether Iran, it's hard to frame it because with Iran, when we look at its internal security structure, it is heavily infiltrated. We saw assassinations of dozens of Iranian nuclear scientists over the years. We saw the assassination of the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Iran. We've seen in the 12-day war, Iranian officials, heads of the army, heads of the IRGC, killed, assassinated. We saw videos of Israeli agents operating within Iran. We know that Iran is also home to an insurgency in the east, the Baluch Liberation Army, and in the west with the Kurdish Independent Movement, the PJAK. So Iran does have foreign influence. It does have foreign infiltration. These are things that Mike Pompeo said himself in a tweet where he said that Happy New Year's to all the Iranian protesters and all the Mossad operatives on the ground. Whether he was being a bit tongue-in-cheek, it was a stupid tweet to make because it gave the Iranians justification. From what I can see, there are videos of armed protesters. Whether they are how hard they are to authenticate is another story. So I think that Iran has a justification to watch out for foreign interference. Iran has a justification to look for spy networks to arrest people. It says they're in spy networks. If these are true, then that does make sense because we know there are spy networks already operating in Iran. We know there are spy networks fomenting dissent in Iran. However, the justification to shooting protesters is abhorrent, and I don't think any state can justify shooting unarmed peaceful demonstrators, especially people who have been completely impoverished by this hyperinflation, this Weimar level hyperinflation that the Islamic Republic has essentially allowed due to its economic mismanagement.
So, crossing the Gulf to, as we've mentioned, Iran quite profoundly, the UAE has removed British universities from its state scholarship list, citing fears of Islamist radicalization linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is banned across parts of the Middle East, but not in the UK. So what is the strategic logic behind this decision, and how does it reflect broader regional priorities?
So I think that the strategic logic is to put pressure on the British government because the British university sector at the moment is in currently quite a dire state when it comes to funding, and international students can make up the bulk funding for a lot of UK institutions, especially those from the Gulf, as Gulf universities, especially Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they fund UK universities for research and a lot of other projects. So I think that it's a way to put pressure on the UK for diplomatic concessions for the UAE. The UK has previously raised issues around human rights abuses in the UAE. It's home to quite a few organizations that raise awareness regarding labor rights, the treatment of migrant workers, and other issues within the UAE. And of course, the UK has condemned the RSF in Sudan, which is a UAE-backed group, and has even levied sanctions against several RSF generals. In addition, the UK refused to recommend Somaliland, which, while the UAE hasn't recognised yet, there are rumours that it's quietly accepting Somaliland passports. And of course, on top of that, the UK backs Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and it doesn't back the Southern Transitional Council, which the UAE used to back. So I think that it's a way for not just the UAE, but the Gulf states to assert influence in the West. They've already invested huge amounts of capital in Western capital cities, Western institutions, and it's what we're seeing now is a turn of events from the West influencing the Middle East. Now the Middle East is more than happy to influence the West. In regards to the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood is barely existent. it's not really a threat. I went to one of the universities that SOAS, and I saw no sort of influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think it's a way for the UAE to garner support from right-wing journalists and right-wing media figures in the UK, and it's a way for them to sort of hide behind their abhorrent human rights record by trying to claim to be building secular libertarian states within the Middle East.
So, given all these examples you just provided where the UK and the UAE diverge on international issues, would you say that this funding shift represents a broader diplomatic dispute between Abu Dhabi and London, especially over differing approaches to the Muslim Brotherhood, or is this like organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, or is it primarily about influence, domestic politics, and domestic security framing?
I think it's primarily about influence and domestic security framing. I think that in terms of the diplomatic shift, I think that the UAE is still allied to the UK, and the UK is allied to the UAE. The UAE was a former British protectorate, and a lot of institutions were built and are currently maintained by the British. Especially when it comes to the UAE's armed forces, there's a lot of British advisors involved, and there's even former British soldiers serving in parts of the UAE, as advisory capacity in the UAE's military. So I think that when it comes to the UAE, it's simply a framing domestically to try and portray the UAE as this secular free market paradise where you can invest. There's no taxes. There's no there's no government interference. Well, there is little government interference. You can do finance, you can do trade, etc., etc. And I think that is the main sort of framing. The UAE is trying to detach itself from the wider Middle East. It's trying to provide itself as an alternative for investments and finance and a hub for business. And I think its sort of anti-Muslim Brotherhood position, which it's had for decades at this point, is twofold. It's to try and stop any sort of domestic unrest, because the Muslim Brotherhood has been a threat to the Gulf monarchies. The Muslim Brotherhood and socialist movements in the Cold War were one of the key threats highlighted by the Gulf monarchies as a threat to their stability, and I think that this will continue. As the fall of the Soviet Union happens, we socialist movements for the most part dried up in the region, and as with the Muslim Brotherhood, it's persisted. However, it's more of a way to create a ominous boogeyman for the UAE to justify its sort of authoritarian stances in a lot of areas.
How would you say this decision might affect long-term educational and strategic ties between the UAE and Western partners? You mentioned it sort of flips the dynamic where the Middle East can now influence the West through the capital it has invested, especially in the higher education sector.
So I think that it's definitely a change in how the West interacts with the Middle East. I think that it might cause policymakers to think twice due to all the funding that's been tied up in the Middle East. However, I think that it will cause caution. But in general, I think that as the UAE is sort of separated from the wider sort of UAE in terms of it's had a falling out with Saudi Arabia, it's had a falling out with Qatar. It has issues with a lot of Arab states. So I think that if the Arab states were able to create a unified diplomatic policy, it would be a much greater threat. However, considering the divided nature of the Arab states, it's quite possible for Western institutions to have a balancing act between the various different states and how foreign policy can influence one or the other. So while you might have a fallout with the UAE, relations with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the other Gulf states will remain the same. So it's going to be a balancing act, and it's going to cause a lot more thinking. However, I don't think it will fundamentally shape the way Western foreign policy deals with the Gulf states or the wider Middle East.
So turning to Syria, while there have been less headlines this winter in comparison to last winter when the Assad regime was overthrown, there are still ongoing clashes between government forces, Kurdish groups, and other non-state actors. How has the Syrian conflict evolved in relative attention compared to Iran and the Gulf, and what should strategic analysts be watching for next?
So I think what's interesting with Syria is that what we have two Western proxies, well, not Western proxies, Western-backed forces in Syria fighting. So we have the SDF, which was and still hosts several American bases. We have the new Syrian government under Ahmed al-Shara, who is also supported by the West. There's been sanctions relief. They're eyeing Syria for investing, for development, for rebuilding from the war. So I think that its attention is going to be to a lesser extent, simply because with Iran, there's a foreign policy justification they want to make for intervention into Iran, for increased sanctions, for increased anti-Iran stance regionally and towards Iran in of itself. So I think with Syria, because it's two Western allies essentially fighting, the interests aren't going to be as great, because essentially it's a fallout of foreign policy decision making that wasn't made for the long term. It was made for the short term. There's an issue with ISIS. Kurds will use the Kurds. We'll help the Kurds recruit Arab tribes to fight ISIS. They have their own state. And then with the Idlib offensive in 2024, I do not think many Western policymakers saw it coming. So I think that's why the SDF is fighting, is because I don't think Western policymakers thought that the new government at the moment would come to place, and that the SDF would just be a Western sort of finger into Syria, and it would be a way to continuing to delegitimize the Assad regime. However, the Assad regime has fallen. So the attention it will receive will be a lot less in the process, because there's not really a narrative that the West wants to portray in the media between the two sides, because both sides are Western allies. There's not a narrative they can really portray. What I am seeing is that influencers and journalists who are pro the protesters in Iran are supportive of the SDF, because the SDF likes to maintain a secular liberal front for its Western audiences, despite the fact that it's been accused of recruiting child soldiers. And I'm seeing that, generally speaking, people who are pro the government of Iran are pro neither side. So it's quite interesting in terms of how the split is between the people that support the various sides in Iran and that support the SDF or the Syrian government in Syria.
So just as you mentioned the connected nature maybe of people's perception on Iran and Syria, would you say that these theatres are somehow connected, or are they distinct theatres with different drivers and are fairly independent of each other despite being in this interconnected region?
So I think Syria used to be connected with Iran in the face of the Syrian civil war because of its place in the axis of resistance, which featured Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis in Yemen, and the Hashd-e-Shaabi, which are the Iraqi Shia militias. So these groups and countries formed part of the Axis resistance. And at the time, Syria, under the Assad regime, was linked with Iran. However, now what's happened is the Assad regime has fallen, and this new Syrian government, they've made overtures to each other, the Syrian government and Iran. I think that when looking at a framing of what Iran wants in the region, well, there's rumors that it has some support. It's given some support to the SDF. These are all unsubstantiated. And I think that if we look at Iran's long-term interests in the region, maintaining good relations with the Syrian government will help it maintain its influence in Lebanon by being able to aid its ally Hezbollah. Whereas the SDF, which started for the most part as Kurdish separatist organizations, and I mentioned earlier that Iran also has an issue dealing with armed Kurdish separatists insurgencies in its western provinces. So I think that while they're not interlinked, that interests of the Syrian government and Iran do ally when it comes to dealing with the SDF, which are a lot more of an overt Western ally than this current Syrian government with Ahmed al-Shara and the various militias still maintaining quite a strong Islamist ideology. So I think that while they're not currently interlinked, and they are not as interlinked as they used to be, there is a shared interest in repressing Kurdish separatism by the Syrian government and by Iran.
Zooming out, taking a bigger picture view of the region, when compared to hard power metrics in the region, military deployments or direct interventions like we saw last year with the Israeli-American strikes in Iran, how central would you say has information control and economic pressure become as instruments of statecraft in the Middle East, notably the sanctions in Iran? Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just about to mention the sanctions in Iran. So when it comes to economic pressures and sanctions, for the most part, they haven't worked. They haven't really done much to. I think there's two ways to frame it. So with sanctions give a really good justification and a blanket excuse for governments and regimes in the region to mismanage the economy, for corruption, for nepotism, because they can blame so much on sanctions. And it was the same in Syria when it was sanctioned after the harsh repression of revolutionaries in 2011, and it's the same in Iran. These governments are able to essentially lie to their people or manipulate the facts in order to hide government inefficiency, inequality, and government corruption. So I don't think sanctions work per se. I think that sanctions are good in some ways in terms of limiting countries' access to dual-use technologies and military technologies. So the Iranian Air Force is in a really sorry state. They can't get spare parts. Even their carriers, their airlines, for instance, they struggle to maintain and equip that. They reverse engineer a lot, but there's still a lot of issues with how their Air Force and their air carriers are able to function. So I think that economic sanctions, they are very inefficient. I think they can create a rally around the flag effect. I think that they cause a lot of suffering with ordinary people. And I think that if you see the effects of sanctions firsthand, while you do have some proponents that say, we will take sanctions if the regime falls, I think that, the level of human suffering they cause is not worth it. And I think that at the end of the day, when the regime does fall, people are going to remember the regime falling, but they're also going to remember the effects of sanctions. They're not going to remember not being able to get medication for their children. They're going to remember, hospital shortages. They're going to remember a lot of things like that. And it should be noted that with sanctions, the issue is not the sanctions in and of themselves. It's how companies act with the sanctions. So a lot of goods can actually be traded with Iran. However, companies are so afraid of being seen as evading sanctions and having huge financial penalties that it's better off for them not to trade. So you see this with a lot of pharmaceutical companies. You see this with a lot of companies who could, in theory, do trade with countries like Iran, but they don't want to because they're afraid of being sanctioned by the US, by the European Union, and the huge financial policies that entails. So the sanctions weaken regimes, but they also give regimes justification because they can cause a rally around the flag effect. And of course, they can hide huge amounts of corruption, nepotism, and things of that nature. When it comes to information warfare, social media is an amazing soft power tool. And I think it's something that even Western governments struggle to maintain because we've seen all this thing with, disinformation from various different political extremist sides, and that the European governments are struggling to sort of get a hand on it. And it's the same thing with Iran. It's the same thing with all these countries in the Middle East, that information warfare and disinformation, you can't really stop it because it's social media, and the only way to stop it is essentially either cut off all the internet or create an intranet, which is what China have done with their Great Firewall. So it is incredible, especially with Western soft power. TikTok, Instagram. You can be in like a really remote village in anywhere in the Middle East, and you will see people doing TikTok dances. You'll see kids doing TikTok dances. You'll see all kinds of things like that. So it's so pervasive, and it's one of the key ways for Western powers to get the word out and to try and foment dissent and to spread their influence in these countries. However, it also can be the reverse. So you're seeing a lot of Western people now who are pro-Iran. You're seeing them talk about, the Islamic Republic in such an amazing light, and it's a double-edged sword. It's the best way to put it. It's a double-edged sword. It can go either way.
So I think that would merit. I think both points would merit an episode on their own. Moving on, in an environment of constrained visibility from internet blackouts, which have happened in the past, not only recently in Iran, to state media dominance, how would you assess protest movements and government responses without falling into misinformation traps? Like we mentioned, social media is polarized. There's lots of misinformation with the advent of AI as well.
So how I assess them is I look at both sides, and as frustrating as it is to look at both sides, it's the only way you can sort of assess them. Because if I looked at the anti-regime side, I would think the Khomeini he's in Moscow already, and Iran is about to collapse. And then if I look at the pro-regime side, it's the streets are quiet in Tehran. There's no protesters, and all the protesters are armed with machine guns, and they're burning down mosques, and they're killing police officers. These things have happened. However, have they happened to the extent the pro-regime pundits and state media is saying? Is again, it's hard to substantiate, but at the same time, it's hard to substantiate the anti-regime side's claim. So I think looking at both sides is probably the only thing you can do, and try and find a balance within that, because the best sort of disinformation is where you tell one truth and surround it with lies, because that one truth props up the rest of the lies. And both sides are very good at doing that, and they're increasingly becoming sophisticated. And I think that's not just within Iran, but the wider region. We're going to see sophisticated disinformation and information warfare going forward in the future.
If you were advising policymakers in the West, what would you say is the biggest strategic blind spot they might be underestimating with respect to information suppression and domestic unrest in regional powers like Iran?
So I think when it comes to information suppression, these countries can just turn the internet off, and they can also create firewalls like China created. So it's sort of like you have to tread very lightly when it comes to how you want to spread soft power in these countries, because while it can benefit you, it can also turn people against you. And of course, it's a double-edged sword. So while you can spread soft power one way, soft power can be spread the other way against you. So it's quite interesting to see how a lot of youth in the Middle East are very for. Some of them will be very for America, but a lot of them will be very anti-America. A lot of them will be very anti-Israel. So it's a case of how information is perceived. It's also influenced by facts on the ground. And I think one of the things is that while we look at the Middle East as separate, or we look at it as the Arab world with like Turkey and Iran as well, it's very sort of hard to create a unified message, and it's very hard to counter a message, because when it comes to sort of the nuances with language and the nuances with various things, like if you put a message out that in English to these regions, you are going to attract a very small subset of the population who speaks English. And if you put a message out in Arabic, then you're going to have to deal with the nuances of different dialects, formalities, and of course, how obvious that it is that this message in Arabic, how authentic is it? Has it come from someone who speaks Arabic? Has it come from someone who's learned Arabic? So it's very hard for Western policymakers to be able to go and spread information, because it is a giant blind spot, and blind spots will keep being created because you'll think you've done one thing and there'll be a counter. It's like in Iraq, for instance, in the 2000s, there was a huge spread of like emo culture and goth culture, and I think various militias just started targeting them and using physical violence essentially against sort of people who practice this culture. So while you can spread Western culture into these countries and spread Western influence, there will be a backlash, and the backlash can be violent, and it can be more detrimental. In terms of general blind spots, I think that there's a thing called wishful thinking analysis that I like to call it, where Western policy, it's just an extension of Orientalism essentially, where Western policymakers will see the region and perceive events in the region, especially when it comes to unrest, as how they want to see it. So they will see protests in Iran, and they will say, oh, they want a secular state. They will see, they'll go to Egypt and they'll see like bars and nightclubs, and they'll be like, oh, the Middle East is secularizing. Egypt has always had bars and nightclubs. So it's like that. So people analyze the Middle East going in a trajectory that they want it to go in it, and they pick either anecdotes that they've experienced, news stories, and they put it together and create a narrative for themselves to want to shape the Middle East, and to hope that they just wish the Middle East goes in one way, and it happens in reverse too. You'll see people who go to the Middle East and they'll say, oh, the Middle East is increasingly becoming religious, because that's the narrative they want the Middle East to be. And I think that as we go forward, the Middle East is choosing its own path. Each nation state is choosing its own path, culturally, religiously, spiritually, and materially, in how it is internally, how its society is, and how it is externally. And I think that as much as you want country X to go this way, it might not go this way. It might continue in the trajectory. And I think that using wishful thinking and analysis, it's not bad to have hope. It's not bad to want what you want for other people. However, it can cause a huge blind spot, and it can create sort of massive misunderstandings of the culture, of the lifestyle, of people's hopes and dreams. I think one of the things is when I talked about how people would look at the Iran protests and think they want a secular government. They might want a secular government, but the primary cause of these protests was hyperinflation. It was people having to take bags and bags of cash to go to the shops. It was, and I've seen people have bags and bags of cash, and it is insane. And we can put all these things. We can say, oh, these protesters, they want Pavlovi's back. They want this. But by doing this, we deny people in the region their agency, and that is something that if we do, it will only go against policymakers in the long term, because it will be seen as things happening from the top down. So when things happen from the top down, it's like with the Islamic Republic. They've tried to Islamize society from the top down, and human beings naturally rebellious. People revolted. And if you do the same thing with secularism, if you do the same thing with any ideology you want to imprint on the region, and in just any region in total, people are going to rebel against it. So I think that's one of the biggest blind spots, is seeing events in the Middle East and trying to shape them in the way you want them to, rather in the way they actually are happening and the reality. I think people are very focused on trying to implement certain values or certain economic conditions in the Middle East, when a lot of countries in the Middle East don't have 24 hours electricity. They don't have clean drinking water. So unrest primarily comes from these basic needs that aren't met. And once these needs are met, then you can have a discussion of values, etc. But at this current point, it's the biggest understanding is to understand the Middle East is that a lot of people in the regions, their basic needs, whether it comes to employment, housing, electricity, healthcare, water security, aren't being met, and these issues will cause the unrest. And then when it comes to social values, etc., these things are important to a lot of people in the region. I'm not going to deny that, However, the primary cause of unrest will always be these material concerns until these material concerns are addressed in the wider region.
Thank you. What would you say are the 3 key takeaways you'd want our listeners to remember about what we've discussed, so protest movements, regional security, and the role of media and technology in shaping that region?
So I think that when it comes to media and technology, I think it's important to constantly look at both sides. Don't think because you have one really good Telegram channel that you shouldn't get others. Don't think that because you follow one good account on Twitter that you should follow loads more. Follow people who are anti-regime, follow people who are pro-regime, follow people who are neutral, because it's the only way you're able to create a huge picture for yourself in how you address not just protest events in Iran, but the current events in Syria, how Lebanon's dealing with the disarmament of Hezbollah, for instance. Everything, you need to look at both sides, because that's the best way you're going to create a comprehensive analysis for yourself, and it's the best way you're going to able to beat the propaganda, to beat the misinformation, is if you actively engage with disinformation on both sides. And it's going to be frustrating. You're going to look at, oh my god, like, why are people like, you're going to have these moments, but you need to do it in order to get a comprehensive picture in the region. I think when it comes to how you look at the Middle East, look at events first, and then think about, sort of analyze what they're happening. And is it something you want to happen, or is it something that's actually happening? And always, when it comes to unrest in the Middle East, generally speaking, most of the time, it's material concerns, it's economic concerns, it's shortage of jobs, it's wide levels of unemployment, it's people feeling, like they have no hope. So I think it's an important thing for people to look at and not neglect, is the material conditions of that foments unrest in the Middle East. When it comes to media, when it comes to social media, I think social media, when we look at people from the region, and we engage with people from the region, I think one of the most important things to realize is, if you speak English and you only speak English, your accounts are going to be very skewed on what's happening, because you're only engaging with English speakers. If you know Arabic, again, you will have a wider opinion. Obviously, a lot of people don't have time to learn Arabic. It's completely fine. But it's something to keep in mind when engaging with narratives in the Middle East, that by speaking English, you will see a very small subset of what's going on in the region. You'll see people who are, can speak English, who are educated for the most part, to a higher level, or for instance, a lot of people who are more than happy to engage in Western culture. However, there are some people who are educated in the Middle East who just speak Arabic and don't learn English because they don't want to. So it's something to consider when you deal with the Middle East on social media, when you look at accounts and people based in the Middle East, is if they are speaking to you in English and you're engaging them in English and you're looking at their accounts and of an event in English, then you're going to look at a small subset. And this subset can be either side. It doesn't have to be one side or another. But when it comes to increased disinformation and states getting more into social media and being able to create bots and nuances, it's something to consider, that why are they speaking? Why is this message being crafted in English? Why is this message not being crafted in Arabic? Because sometimes there will be different accounts in Arabic and English, and regimes, governments, media figures will portray different narratives in different languages. So it's something to always consider.
Finally, if you were to summarize the landscape of the Middle East today, given these recent developments that we've discussed, in one sentence, how would you put it?
I would say heading towards stability. I'm very hopeful for the Middle East long term. I think that a lot of countries are slowly going down a path of stability. A lot of people are slowly seeing developments in the region. Whether that development is happening fast enough for them, again, like I said before, there's a lot of poverty and unemployment and water scarcity in the Middle East. But I think in the next few decades, I think that a lot of countries in the Middle East that were previously known for instability, Iraq and Syria first and foremost, will see a renaissance in terms of how their economic and cultural spheres, and they will be increasingly become stable as time goes on. However, the one thing with the Middle East is that there is a spectre hanging over it, and that spectre is climate change. And I think that some parts of the Middle East, I think Iraq and Kuwait, they experience summer where the weather gets to 50 degrees Celsius. They're experiencing droughts, salinization of the marshes in Iraq. So this is a big thing. So while it's going to be stable in the short term, and it looks like it's heading towards stability, in the long term, climate change will become the biggest issue, and it will become the biggest source of conflict. However, I think for now the region is looking increasingly stabilized. We're seeing the wrapping up of the Syrian civil war as we speak, with the SDF increasingly losing ground to defected Arab tribes and the Syrian government. And we're seeing sort of the winding down of various conflicts, or the freezing of conflicts. With Sudan will remain an outlier, but Sudan has for a very long time had ongoing conflicts with various different rebel groups. I think that eventually, especially as the UAE gets a bloody nose from its foreign policy follies in Yemen, will wind down the support of the RSF. And I think that slowly the RSF will eventually come to a peace agreement with the government, or be routed entirely from the country. But in general, I would say heading towards stability is the best way to describe the Middle East currently in a sentence.
Finally, could you briefly recommend 2 or 3 readings or podcasts or sources for listeners who want to explore these issues further?
So yes, I think that one of the best readings to understanding the Islamic Republic's governance is Iran as a peculiar hybrid regime. It is really great for understanding the complete mess that is the Islamic Republic, and why the Islamic Republic's governance system is the mess that it is. I think they have dual systems, triple systems. The only thing that I can just use to describe it is sort of a similar system to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you have such a mess of competing parliaments, competing powers, competing councils. So I think that's really good for understanding the governance mess that Iran is in, and will always be in unless there are significant reforms. In terms of sort of understanding and keeping up to date with the Middle East and wider conflicts in the region, it's not a podcast or a reading, but it's an app called Live AU Mapper, or Live AU Map. It basically collates open source intelligence, and there's a paid version. I'm not sponsored or anything. There's a paid version and there's an unpaid version. The unpaid version is great. The paid version is good as well. There's no ads, but it's really good. You can go, you can select Syria, you can find out what's going on as things happen day by day. You can select sort of the situation in Israel and Palestine. You can do Iran. It's really good for keeping up to date on events. And from what I can tell, there's no spin. It's just things happening. Sometimes, there's wordings like Russia claims X, Iran claims Y. Claims is something else other than proof. So it's really good for understanding. And in terms of sort of keeping up to date with Iran's protests, I would say the Institute for the Study of War has a very good day-by-day what's going on in Iran. And I would say for alternative media that is not necessarily going to parrot the Western line, because when it comes to, The Guardian, the BBC, we know what they're going to say for the most part, and we know how they're going to portray events. So I think that in terms of alternative media, to get the full picture, because to understand you're going to need the full picture, The Cradle is a very good source.
Great. I think you didn't mention the source on the governance structure of Iran.
I did. Iran is a peculiar case as a hybrid regime.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you. So that will be in the show notes. Thank you, Arthur, for your time.
No worries.
Security Fair is the Centre for International Security and Economic Strategies podcast, looking at the ideas, events, and decisions shaping strategy, defence, economics, and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson. Our guest has been Arthur Woollam-Hughes. See you next time.